Vector-borne diseases are diseases which are transmitted by an organism, like, for example, a mosquito. And prominent examples of it here in Africa would be malaria is the most prominent one, which is transmitted by the anopheles mosquito. There is also dengue, which would be transmitted by the Aedes mosquito. And finally, diseases transmitted by culex, which would include lymphatic filariasis. Vectors have a better survival in tropical countries, like, for example, sub-Saharan Africa. That's why there are so many vector-borne diseases here. Also, there were malaria vectors in Europe. There was malaria in the United Kingdom, in Italy, and it has been eliminated. So it is economic development on one hand side that you reduce the contact with the vector, and on the other hand side, the prevalence of the mosquitoes in certain countries compared to others. What type of a disease is malaria? Malaria, as we mentioned, is a vector-borne disease. It's transmitted by anopheles mosquitoes. It's a febrile disease, so the hallmark of the disease is that you have fever, but it is protean in presentation. So some people present with a splitting headache, others have vomiting and diarrhea, and others are just overwhelmingly tired, prostration, can't get out of bed anymore. So there are a range of presentations for this disease that makes it so important to have a proper diagnosis, which requires the appropriate diagnostic tools. The epidemiology of malaria is related to the force of infections. So if you have a lot of infections and a continuous risk, small children already get infected very early on, and by the time they reach 5 years, they have developed a semi-state of immunity, which is called premonition. So they still become infected, but they have no more symptoms. So it's a semi-immunity to malaria. And then when they become older, when they are teenagers, they have absolutely no symptoms anymore, but they are infectious and they transmit the disease still. That is in an area here, like Ntwara. If you go to Asia, it's different because there are not so many infections, so people remain susceptible into adulthood, and mostly adults have malaria. So the diagnosis of malaria has changed over the last 20 years in rather complex ways. In the last century, the mainstay of malaria diagnosis was microscopy. And microscopy provides a lot of information, but also requires a lot of skills to do it well. So you need trained microscopists to get an accurate diagnosis. It has now been mostly replaced by rapid diagnostic tests, RDTs, for clinical purposes, and with PCR for research purposes. So the microscopy is still used, and there are still practitioners who know how to do really good microscopy, but mostly researchers use RDTs for the immediate diagnosis and treatment, and PCR later on for more detailed assessment of the infection. So the treatment of malaria in the last century was monotherapy with a drug like, for example, chloroquine. And over time, there were resistant strains of Plasmodium falciparum emerged. So the treatment had to be adjusted, new treatments had to be found. So we switched from chloroquine to sulfadoxine pyrimethamine, and then finally to the artemisinins. And it became clear that there would be also quickly, or there could be resistant strains could be emerging. Therefore, it was combined with a partner drug. So, for example, artemether is combined with lumefantrine, which then makes it likely that it takes longer until resistance can emerge. We are now using new drug classes, but also we are trying to develop triple therapies in which ACTs are combined with a further partner drug to make to protect the partner drugs for longer. The approaches to reduce the vector burden are twofold. There is indoor insecticide spraying and bed nets. Both of them, insecticide spraying as well as bed nets, depend on functioning insecticides. So if mosquitoes develop resistance to these insecticides, the intervention is pretty useless. And that has happened throughout Africa initially. So where there 20 years ago, there were a few small islands in sub-Saharan Africa where there was insecticide resistance, and that has now changed that there are maybe only a few patches left over in Africa where mosquitoes are universally susceptible to these insecticides. So the large majority of mosquitoes in sub-Saharan Africa are resistant to a range of insecticides, which then leads to a race where human beings continuously have to discover new insecticides and produce them and roll them out, and the mosquitoes have to adapt to them. And that has been happening over the last 2 decades, time and time again. So it would make sense to find other approaches to separate the mosquito from the human being. And since the idea of a star home, which is not completely impregnable by mosquitoes, but reduces the chances that mosquitoes come inside considerably.